month after my cousin Mark died, his widow Alina appeared on my doorstep drenched and shaking, carrying a velvet box and an apology for being late. Inside was my grandmother's emerald ring, the one Mark swore he'd keep safe until I found a love worth its weight. He died without telling Alina the story, just that I'd understand. He hadn't given me jewelry. He'd given me permission to finally stop hiding from the promises I was too afraid to keep. I was 12 when Mark made that promise. He was the brother I never had, but his life pulled him into high-stakes business, and I'd met his wife, Alina, only twice. So when she showed up with a velvet box, I expected a forgotten photo. Instead, I was holding the reason I'd never let anyone close. Alina stood shivering on the porch, rainwater pooling around her shoes, but she refused to step inside until I opened the box. Her eyes were red-rimmed, voice frayed from a month of grief. I lifted the lid and the emerald caught the hall light like green fire. For a second I couldn't breathe. She didn't wait for me to speak. "He said you'd understand this," she repeated, as if the words had been memorized, as if delivering them was her final duty. I nodded because I couldn't manage anything else. She took my hand, squeezed once, and walked back into the rain. The box stayed open in my palm long after her tail lights vanished. I was 34 years old, and a childhood promise I'd turned into a shield had just come knocking. Mark and I grew up 3 houses apart in a town that measured success by how early you left. Our grandmother, a sharp-eyed woman who'd survived 2 wars and 1 terrible marriage, had exactly 1 piece of real jewelry. That ring. She'd pull it out after Sunday dinners, tell us stories about the emerald's journey from a flooded mine in Colombia to a dusty pawnshop in Philadelphia where her father bought it for $19 and a handshake. Mark would lean forward, elbows on the table, already dreaming of grand gestures. I'd sit back, already afraid of losing things. He was the one who declared at 12 that the ring would stay with him until I found a love worth it. I laughed because 12-year-old boys don't talk like that. But Mark wasn't a normal 12-year-old. He was the kind of person who made vows and built his life around them. He went into private equity, made millions disappear and reappear in different accounts, married a woman who could read a boardroom faster than anyone could pour coffee. Alina. I met her at the wedding briefly, then again at a funeral for an uncle where we exchanged fewer than 20 words. She was elegant and guarded, the kind of woman who understood her husband's intensity but didn't always know how to step into his childhood. After the funeral, Mark clapped my shoulder and said, "You'll find her, man, when you're ready." I nodded. I was never ready. By the time Mark died, I'd perfected the art of keeping people at a comfortable distance. Not cruelty, just architecture. I had a quiet life, a job restoring furniture that required patience and solitude, a 1-bedroom apartment above a bakery, 2 friends I saw twice a year, and a string of relationships that ended the same way. The woman would say I was kind but unreachable. I'd say I needed more time. The truth was simpler and uglier. I'd turned my grandmother's ring into a test no one could pass. Not consciously, not with malice. But somewhere beneath the surface, I decided that anyone I loved had to be worth the weight of that promise. And no one ever was. I pushed people away before they could disappoint the standard Mark had set. The ring wasn't just jewelry. It was a verdict I'd been handing down before anyone even knew they were on trial. After Alina left, I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the emerald until the light outside turned gray. I couldn't bring myself to put it away. The ring had become a monument to everything I'd avoided. Mark was gone, and the only person left to release me from the promise was the one who'd made it. Except he had released me in his final days to a woman who didn't even know what she was carrying. I thought about all the relationships I'd let dissolve. Sarah, who'd asked for a key and gotten a speech about needing more time. Lena, who'd moved across the country because I couldn't say the word future without flinching. Even the small connections I'd smothered before they started, the barista who wrote her number on my cup, the neighbor who invited me to dinner, the friend of a friend who smiled at a party and I turned away because I was already measuring her against a promise no one could keep. The ring had cost me years without ever leaving Mark's safe. Then I picked up the box again, tracing its frayed velvet edge, and noticed something beneath the cushion. A folded corner of paper I'd missed. My heart thudded once. I pulled it free. Not a letter, but a receipt, dated 3 months before Mark died, from a jeweler in Seattle. The work order described a resizing of an antique emerald ring with a note in Mark's handwriting along the margin. 5 words. I read them, then read them again, and the careful architecture of my whole adult life cracked straight down the middle. The note said, "Time to let someone in." 5 words in Mark's slanted handwriting, the same handwriting that had signed birthday cards and underlined my name in his wedding program. I stared at the receipt until the letters blurred. He'd known. Not just that I was alone, but that I'd been holding the ring like a locked door. He'd taken it to a jeweler, had it resized for a hand that wasn't mine, and paid with a credit card that would outlive him. The man who made millions by betting on futures that scared everyone else had just made one last investment me. I called Alina at 11 that night. She answered on the second ring, her voice thick with interrupted sleep. I told her about the receipt, about the note. There was a long pause. Then she said, "He had the ring for 2 weeks before he went into the hospital. When he came home, he handed me the box and said I had to wait 1 month after the funeral. Exactly 1 month. He said grief needs a calendar or it turns into a hiding place." I closed my eyes. He'd been managing my mourning from the grave. "Did he tell you what he wrote?" I asked. "No," she said, "but he told me something else. He said, Adam thinks he's protecting people by keeping them out. Tell him I figured out too late that nobody wins a game of distance." That sentence hit like a door slamming open. Mark, the risk-taker, the empire builder, the man who'd married a woman he pursued across 3 countries, had his own quiet regret. I'd always assumed he thought I was just slow or cautious, but he'd been watching me starve myself of connection, and he'd waited until he couldn't speak anymore to give me the one thing that might crack the armor. Not a speech, not a confrontation. A ring and 5 words. I spent the next 3 days doing what grief does when it collides with guilt. I went through old photographs, texts, emails. I found a message Mark had sent 2 years ago, right after I'd ended things with Lena. It said, "You're not still waiting for some mythical woman, are you? Because she's not showing up on a white horse. She's probably already in your life and you're just not looking hard enough." I deleted the thread without replying. I'd been furious not at him, but at the thing I didn't want to admit. He was right. There was a woman I'd been deliberately not looking at. Her name was Dana. She ran the bakery beneath my apartment, a compact brick building that smelled of sourdough and honey at 6 every morning. She was 36, widowed young like Alina, and she laughed with her whole body. She'd given me her number on a napkin once 3 years ago when I'd complimented her croissants and meant it. I still had the napkin. I'd never called. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that I had almost called. Last winter, when pipes froze and I spent 2 hours in the bakery because her heat was working and my apartment wasn't, she poured me coffee and asked if I was seeing anyone. I said no. She said, "Me neither. Hard to find someone who doesn't treat pain like a secret." I felt the invitation, the open door. And I'd changed the subject because I could feel the ring, the ghost of it, around my finger even though it was 3 states away in Mark's safe. I wasn't protecting her from my unreachable heart. I was protecting myself from the possibility that she might be the one who could reach it. Alina called me on the 4th day. She said she'd found another box, this one in Mark's office, with my name on it. She read me the contents over the phone, voice trembling. Inside were photos of our grandmother, the ring on her hand, and a note in her handwriting that I'd never seen. "To my boys, this stone saw me through 2 wars and 1 terrible marriage." It didn't save me. I saved myself. But it reminded me that love is not a reward for being strong enough. It's what you get when you stop trying to earn it. Mark had kept that note his entire life. He never shown it to me. He'd let me believe the promise was about measuring love, about worth, about a threshold high enough to justify a lifetime of waiting. But it was the opposite. The promise wasn't a test. It was a hand reaching out, and I'd been staring at it for 22 years without ever taking it. That night I walked down the stairs into the bakery while Dana was closing up. The overhead lights were off, just the warm glow of the pastry case illuminating her face as she wiped down the counter. She looked up when I walked in, surprised, then careful. I hadn't been down in weeks. I'd been avoiding her ever since I got the call about Mark. She set down the rag. "Hey," she said softly. "You okay?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out the velvet box. Her eyes went to it, then back to my face. "I need to tell you something," I said, and for the first time in my entire adult life, I didn't know what came next. Dana didn't reach for the box. She didn't step closer or ask what was inside. She just looked at me, steady and unnervingly calm, as if she'd been expecting this exact moment for years. The bakery had gone silent except for the hum of the refrigerator, and I stood there with my throat locked around 1,000 words that all felt like the wrong ones. Before I could force anything out, she spoke first. "I know what that is." Her voice wasn't surprised. It was gentle, almost apologetic. "Mark told me." The room tilted. I heard the words but couldn't assemble them into meaning. Dana wiped her hands on a towel, came around the counter, and leaned against it like she was bracing for something heavy. "He came into the bakery about 6 months ago," she said. 6:30 in the morning, before I'd even opened. I thought he was a customer who'd misread the hours, but he introduced himself as your cousin, and then he asked if I had a few minutes to talk about the most important person in your life. She paused. At first I thought he meant himself. Then he pulled out a photo of that ring. I still couldn't speak. My hand tightened around the box until the velvet edges bit into my palm. Dana continued, her eyes never leaving mine. "He told me the whole story. Your grandmother, the promise, the emerald, the safe. And he told me you'd been using that ring as a reason to keep everyone out. He said you were the best person he knew, and that you'd probably go to your grave alone unless someone intervened." She smiled, but it was sad. "He asked me to be that someone." The weight of that confession landed in my chest like a stone. Mark hadn't just sent a ring and a note. He'd recruited a witness to my potential. He walked into a bakery at dawn and asked a woman I'd been avoiding to love me before I even gave her permission to know me. I felt exposed, manipulated, and strangely, devastatingly cared for all at once. "Why didn't you tell me?" I finally managed. Dana pushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "Because I needed to know if you'd ever come down those stairs on your own. Not for Mark, not for the ring, but for me. He said you needed to choose without pressure. So I waited. 3 years. She'd been watching me come and go, buying croissants and never meeting her eyes, and she'd been holding a secret that could have cracked my whole defense at any moment. She'd chosen patience while I chose avoidance. That was the part I couldn't stomach. Not that I'd been set up, but that the setup had been so generous and I'd been so blind. "I almost called you so many times," I said, and my voice came out hoarse. "I had your napkin, I still have it." Dana's expression flickered with something raw. "I know I watched you not call. Every week I'd think maybe this is the day he finally asks for coffee instead of a baguette. And every week you pay, smile politely, and bolt." She folded her arms. "It hurt, Adam. But Mark said you were worth waiting for." I set the box on the counter and opened it. The emerald gleamed under the dim light, green and ancient, and for the first time since I'd opened it on my doorstep, it didn't feel like a monument. It felt like a question. Dana looked at it, then back at my face. "He told me you thought no one could ever be worth the weight of that promise. He said you were wrong. He said the ring wasn't a test. It was a reminder that love can survive anything, even your own fear." She paused. "He also said he hoped you'd figure that out before you lost the one person who already knew your worst secret and still wanted to stay." That word, already, hung between us like the last note of a song. I thought about the receipt, the 5 words in Mark's handwriting, the grandmother who saved herself and then reminded her boys that love wasn't earned. I thought about every woman I'd measured against an impossible standard, every door I'd closed because the ring was easier to carry than vulnerability. And then I thought about Dana, waking at 4 every morning to bake bread for strangers, losing her husband young, and still showing up with laughter and honey and an open heart that I'd treated like a background feature of my building. She passed the test I hadn't even realized she was taking. I was the one who'd been failing it. I reached into the box and lifted the ring between my fingers. It caught the light, and for the first time it felt warm, not heavy. "Mark wrote something on the receipt," I said. "Time to let someone in." Dana's eyes glistened. "I know," she whispered. "He told me he'd leave you that note. He said if you came down here with this box, I should ask you one question." She took a step closer. "He's not asking anymore, Adam. I'm asking. Are you ready to let someone in?" The bell over the bakery door chimed, but neither of us turned. Outside, a street lamp flickered on, casting a long rectangle of yellow light across the floor. I looked at the ring, then at Dana, and I felt the architecture I'd spent 34 years building begin to come apart. Not from force, but from a single choice I hadn't yet made. Mark had done his part. Elena had delivered the box. Grandmother had left the note. And now, all that remained was whether the man holding the emerald could finally become the man who deserved it. "Dana," I said, and I heard my voice steady for the first time in years. "There's something I should have told you 3 years ago." And I began with the napkin. I told her about the napkin. The way her handwriting slanted upward, the phone number beneath a coffee stain shaped like a crescent moon. I'd kept it in the drawer beside my bed for 3 years, pulling it out on nights when loneliness felt like a verdict instead of a season. She listened without interrupting, arms still folded, her expression unreadable except for the slight tremor at the corner of her mouth. When I finished, she exhaled slowly, the way someone does after holding their breath through a long, uncertain climb. "I thought maybe you'd forgotten it," she said, "or thrown it away." I kept telling myself you weren't interested, and that was fine. People aren't obligated to return feelings, but I couldn't shake this sense that you were interested and just too afraid to act on it. She met my eyes. "Mark confirmed that." I nodded. The confirmation no longer stung. It landed like relief. For the first time, I wasn't embarrassed that someone had seen through me. I was grateful. "He said you were the most decent man he knew," Dana continued, "but that you'd turned a childhood promise into a prison. He said you didn't need to find someone worthy of a ring. You needed to realize you were already worthy of receiving what someone else was offering." Her voice cracked slightly. "I've been offering for 3 years, Adam. I just didn't want to force you to take it before you were ready." The bakery had grown quiet again, the street outside empty, the world reduced to the two of us and a piece of jewelry that had traveled through generations to arrive at this exact moment. I lifted the ring again. The emerald glowed, and I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Along the inside of the band, worn almost smooth by decades of wear, was an inscription. "For the one who stays." My grandmother's words, the ones she'd spoken to Mark as a boy without ever telling him she'd had them engraved. He had known, he had carried that secret too. "She didn't just survive 2 wars and a bad marriage," I said quietly. "She stayed. She stayed in her own life, her own heart. That's what the ring means. Not waiting for someone perfect, but refusing to run when things get real." I looked at Dana. "I've been running since I was 12. From expectations, from risk, from the possibility that someone might see me fully and still choose to stay." Dana unfolded her arms. She reached out not for the ring but for my hand. Her fingers were warm, dusted with flour from the day's work. "I'm not asking you to propose tonight," she said. "I'm not asking for forever on the spot, but I've already stayed, Adam. Through your silence, through your avoidance, through 3 years of watching you come down those stairs and never once asking for more than a baguette. I'm still here. So the question isn't whether I'll stay. It's whether you'll finally stop keeping me at a distance." I turned my palm upward, the ring resting in the center. "I want to give this to you," I said, "not as a proposal, as a promise that I'll stop hiding, that I'll stop measuring you against a test no one should ever have to pass, that I'll let you in even when it terrifies me, especially when it terrifies me." I paused. "Will you hold on to it, not as a claim but as a beginning?" Dana looked at the ring, then at me. She didn't speak for a long moment. Then she reached out, her hand hovering over mine. "Only if you understand something first," she said. "Mark didn't just come here to talk about you. He came here to talk about me too. About the walls I'd built after my husband died. About the way I'd convinced myself that being open was too dangerous. He told me we were both guarding empty rooms. And he said if you ever showed up with that box, it meant you decided to stop guarding yours. But I had to decide too." She turned toward the back of the bakery, disappeared through a beaded curtain, and returned a moment later carrying a small, cream-colored envelope. She handed it to me. "He said I should give you this if you ever made it down here with the ring. I've had it in the registered drawer for 6 months, waiting." My name was written on the front in Mark's handwriting. I opened it carefully, my fingers trembling. Inside was a single sheet of paper. 5 sentences in the same slanted script as the receipt. I read them aloud because Dana deserved to hear them and because I needed to make them real by speaking them into the quiet bakery. Adam, if you're reading this, you finally let someone in. I knew you'd choose Dana the night you told me about the napkin and then never mentioned her again. That silence told me everything. The ring wasn't a test to find love worthy of its weight. It was proof that you already are. Stop waiting. Start living. Love, Mark. I folded the letter carefully, my hands steadier than they'd been all night. Dana's cheeks were wet, but she smiled through the tears. He was annoyingly good at that, she said. Getting straight to the thing you'd been hiding from. I slid the ring into her palm and closed her fingers around it. The emerald disappeared behind her knuckles, but its warmth stayed. Not as a question I was afraid to answer, but as an answer I'd been too afraid to hear. The bell over the door chimed again as the first morning bakers arrived for their shifts, and we stepped aside, still holding the ring and the letter and the fragile, terrifying permission Mark had given us both. The world kept turning, but for the first time, I was turning with it. Dana still wears the emerald, not as an engagement ring, but as a reminder that the doors we think are locked are often just waiting for us to turn the handle. She moved upstairs 6 months after that night, and the bakery now smells like sourdough and old books because I can't seem to stop rearranging her shelves. Mark would have laughed at that. He spent his final months arranging a delivery he wouldn't live to see, all because he believed I could still become the person my grandmother's ring was meant for. And he was right. Not because the ring had any magic, but because he knew the right person was already there, holding a secret he'd entrusted to her. Alina still calls me once a month. She says she's finally understanding the man she married piece by piece through the people he loved in secret. Mark had a way of leaving breadcrumbs. I'm just glad I finally followed one. So many of us walk around with invisible tests, measuring everyone against a standard designed to keep them out. What promise are you still holding? What keepsake have you turned into a wall? And who's been standing on the other side, waiting for you to finally open the door? Tell me your story in the comments. If this one hit home, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.